So this is chapter 8 of my book, Avoirdupois, A Life of Weight, and the epigraph is from Joni Mitchell. Up in the sterilized room where they let you be lazy, knowing your attitudes are wrong and you've got to change, and that's not easy. I looked at myself in the mirror above my mother's dresser, a television antenna that had broken off. The small pink television in our room served as my microphone. I moved the antenna toward my lips, tilted my head, closed my eyes. And then I was on stage in front of row after row of smiling faces. Ooh, baby, baby, I sang breathlessly, sneaking a peek at myself in the mirror. Ooh. My hand waved dramatically in front of me, reaching toward the audience and the boy in the front row who clearly adored me. Baby, baby. My new record player was now piled with records, Motown, rock and roll, and folk. I liked it all. I sang along with record after record, hour after hour. The wall next to my bed was covered with photos from 16 magazine, Herman's Hermits, the Beatles, the Monkees, the Dave Clark Five, the Beach Boys, and every new cute boy face that ever adorned the cover. If young heterosexual boys in my generation were in search of hidden copies of their father's Playboy magazines for glossy photos of tits and ass, young hetero girls were given pictures of men from the neck up with sparkling teeth and shining eyes. Every night I pressed my cheek against Every night I pressed my cheek against flat, glossy cheeks and kissed them all goodnight. I went to see A Hard Day's Night with a theater full of libido-driven teenage girls and screamed through the whole thing. John Lennon was my favorite Beatle. John Lennon was the thinker. He published a book of poems and drawings. I bought it the day it came out. He was more than just a pretty face. And I loved the Monkees, particularly Mickey Dolenz. He wasn't the thinker in the group. The thinker was in the Monkees was Mike Nesmith, but I had watched Mickey on the television show Circus Boy. I decided I was going to marry Mickey Dolenz. In an act of devotion, I filled a scrapbook with his pictures. When he got married, I mailed it to him and told him my now destroyed dream of being his wife and wished him well. Months later, I received a handwritten letter saying he hoped we could still be friends. It would be the first of many times I would hear that sentence. Occasionally, I pulled out a recording of The Sound of Music, draped a towel over my head in an attempt to look like a nun, and acted out each scene in front of the mirror, singing every part. I still sang in the choir. I did not practice piano as often as my mother might have liked, but music was my solace, and rock and roll was a driving force in teen culture I longed to be part of. My half of our bedroom was now a shrine to that culture. Mom met Ken at work. He offered to give my mother a ride to work in a carpool he had formed. Every morning, he pulled up in front of our house in his red Volkswagen. Pop-Up stood at the door laughing about the funny-looking red bug car, and Grandmom peeked through the curtain. Grandmom thought it wasn't proper for my mother to take a ride from a man. Mom kissed me goodbye, leaving a bright red lipstick mark on my cheek, and rushed off to work in a trail of perfume. Ken had blue eyes, wavy light brown hair, and a small heart tattooed on his forearm. He was a geologist. He didn't believe in God. He was nothing like the people in our neighborhood. And he was married. His marriage wasn't happy, and maybe meeting my mother gave him the courage to leave his wife. I don't really know, but he did leave his wife. And even after he left his wife, my mother said they were just friends. In the evening, she would sit on the steps that went from the dining room to the upstairs bedrooms and talk with Ken on the phone. My grandmother would glare at her. My grandmother would glare her disapproval. Being a divorced woman was bad. Getting a ride to work from a man in a weird-looking red car was worse. That little red bug of a car changed some things. Ken took us shopping and on weekends road trips to historical sites or to parks for picnics. On the trips, he held me wrapped with details about geological formations. Rocks suddenly took on a quality of beauty and intrigue. Science, which had never been my best subject, seemed so much more interesting. On one of our weekend trips, he asked me if God could do anything. I said yes. He asked, can God make a rock he can't lift? I was dumbstruck. I ran to the ministers with this strange question. They talked about faith and gave me all manner of oblique answers. I decided I was an atheist, like Ken. My inner dialogue with God was a way to have a father. Now I knew my father, and I had Ken. God was going to have to court me back. Mom was happier, but my grandmother's disapproval did not wane. She and my mother argued constantly. Grandmother would suddenly need to use the phone when Mom was talking to Ken. Why was she paying for piano lessons when I never practiced? The new bread that Mom bought at the store Ken took us too far away from our local store was too dense. If Mom wasn't going to eat the food Grandmother had prepared, if she was going to live on liquid diet stuff, then why did she bother to come to the table? It wasn't right that I watched while my black mollies gave birth in the little fish tank that Ken had helped me put together. Mom decided we needed to move into our own apartment. She tried to focus on the idea that I needed my own room, but my grandmother blamed Ken for our departure. He wasn't the only cause of the move, but he did enable it. Sitting on the porch with my grandmother while Ken and my mom packed boxes into his red Volkswagen, I was beyond my skills as a mediator. Grandmom was stony and silent. Her eyebrows seemed permanently arched. Her eyes were watery. I played with her hand and told her I would come visit after school. She shook her head. Papa poked his head out the door once in a while to assess the progress of the packing and my grandmother's mood. Now he would be alone in the house with his wife for the first time in years. A stony, silent wife. We moved to Castle Shannon into the red brick apartments that were built along the edge of the new housing developments and the older, wealthier, bigger house streets. We moved away from Catholic kids and the butcher and the bakery ladies and the barber. We moved away from the five and dime, the lilac bushes, and the blue wooden steps. My grandparents could not afford the house without Mom's assistance, and then one day, Grandma fell down the steps. I wasn't there in front of her. She wasn't leaning on my shoulder the way she had the past few years. She lost her balance and she fell. She broke a bone in her hip and became immobile. Everyone worried that neither she nor my grandfather could safely navigate their world. It was time for them to move into the Methodist Senior Citizen Home. Living in the home meant supervision, cooked meals, and access to medical facilities. It also meant a loss of control. Grandma went from the hospital where she had been taken after her fall straight into the home. Pop-Up stayed in the house long enough for my Aunt Jean, Uncle John, and Mom to pack up the house in which they had been raised. My grandfather liked living in the home. He played shuffleball and socialized. But my grandmother deteriorated mentally. She had braided my hair every morning, made me grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup when I was sick. Now she had trouble remembering my name. As often as I could, I went to the home to visit or take her on shopping trips to downtown Pittsburgh. We would ride the streetcar and walk to Kaufman's department store. Kaufman's Cafe was a favorite for ladies who lunch. Rows of tables for two, covered with white linen tablecloths, set in ornate silver, welcomed us. A waiter in a black waistcoat, starched apron took our order of turkey club sandwiches with the crusts cut off and little balls of ice cream, rolled in pecans and covered with fudge for dessert. Two older ladies sat on our right, chatting away. From time to time, one of them would smile as if to say, "Aren't you the lovely girl having lunch with your grandmother?" "So," Grandma began with her most imperious tone, "you met your father." Our table neighbors suddenly stopped talking. "Yes, Grandma." I glanced at the women to let them know I knew they were listening. "What did you think?" she asked, arching her eyebrows. The ladies leaned slightly toward us. "Oh, he was okay," a voice in my head snipped. He was okay. A voice in my head snipped, and he wasn't dead. I arched my own eyebrow and shot a more direct look at the ladies. They leaned back. "Well, when your mother left, she had to hide the furniture or he would have stolen it." The ladies leaned back in. "Grandma, how would he do that?" "He climbed in the window with his mafia friends." I took a bite of ice cream, fudge and pecans, and smiled at the women. They leaned back, put some money on the table for their food, gathered their purses and gloves and hats, and walked quickly out of the restaurant. It is one thing to know that you cannot always tell your grandmother the truth, and there are things that she won't want to hear. It's quite another to deal with such a decline in mental acuity. She couldn't remember which dollar bills were which. She simply handed me her purse and I paid for lunch. Grandma bought me a book after lunch, The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. I don't remember what it was about in great detail, but I do know it examined the basic constructs of religious belief and that I wanted it. I knew she wouldn't want me to read such a book if she knew what it was about. I wasn't sure if she bought it because of her confused state or if she was signaling that she accepted the idea that I needed to make my own choices. I held her hand while we rode the streetcar through the hills of Pittsburgh, back to the senior citizens' home. She looked out the windows with her watery blue eyes and half smile. Now I had my own room. I attached 2 boards covered with pictures from Life magazine to the back of a bookshelf, which served as an extra wall just at the door of my room. I had my records, my books, my teen fashion magazines, and all the pictures of rock and roll boys coved into that room. Twiggy was on the cover of the fashion magazines in 1967. When she came from England to the United States, she was 5 feet 7 inches tall, and she weighed 91 pounds. I flipped through the magazines and saw no one who looked like me, and no clothes that might look good on me. Twiggy's glossy picture was hanging on the boards in my room. But icons like the Mamas and the Papas were there too. Seeing Cass Elliot on television was thrilling. She was bold and dignified. Her voice soared. There were not many fat women on television. When there was a fat woman, there was a joke. No one could make jokes about Cass Elliot's talent. I loved the music and the affirmation of a fat woman as an equal and loved member of the group. A new album was like a window into social change. I sat in my room reading the backs of albums for clues about what was cool. It was the Beatles who taught me about meditation and the Maharishi. It was Peter Tork of the Monkees whom I saw reading Autobiography of a Yogi in a photo in 16 magazine. I knew I would someday need to read that book. It was the Jefferson Airplane who taught me about the revolution and the word fuck. It was Joan Baez that taught me about Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King. Only hippie girls continued to like the Beatles when they released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the Monkees didn't really play their own instruments. You were a hopeless teeny bopper if you liked them. If you liked the Rolling Stones, you were on a path to being a harlot. I liked them all. I had a cheap red guitar. I took some lessons, but as with the piano, I never really practiced. Instead, I posed with the guitar in front of my mirror and pretended to play while I sang to my ever-present audience. Hours and hours in my room, dreaming myself into being. My room was a place, but it didn't protect me. Getting a divorce in Pennsylvania wasn't easy. I don't remember the details, but it was easier to get a divorce in Virginia. And Virginia was close to Washington, D.C. Ken asked to be transferred to the IRS in Washington, D.C. and moved to Virginia. He was going to need to live there long enough to establish residency. He would come back on the weekends and stay with us in the apartment. I loved having him around. I loved hugging him and burying my nose in his cheek so I could smell his aftershave. I loved the presence of a man in our world. But he started rubbing my breasts against him when we hugged. He stuck his tongue in my ear. He tried to push his tongue in my mouth. When Mom took a shower, he would come into my room and press against me, kiss me. One night, he sucked on my breast. A shockwave ran through my body. Something did not feel right. I wasn't sure why. I was worried about what was happening because of... Something did not feel right. I wasn't sure why. I worried about what was happening because... I worried that what was happening was because of something I was doing. I didn't understand what was happening. I continued to push him away and resist these transgressions, but I still enjoyed him in our life, and Mom seemed oblivious. That summer when I went to Missouri, the aunts, Grandmom, and I went on a driving trip to Texas to visit my father. A lengthy car trip was difficult for Grandma, but she was so happy to have her son back in her life that she decided to go. And there was a new family member to meet, my half-sister Cindy. She was the child from my father's second marriage, the secretary. Her mother had died of cancer and she was living with Dad. When we met, she was wearing a clip-on hairpiece because she wanted to have long, straight hair. It was an auburn hairpiece and her hair was chestnut brown and curly. The hairpiece slipped around on her head and her own unruly hair popped out on the side. She spoke with the same southern drawl I first heard from Dad. She was bouncy and funny and very cute. From time to time, Grandmother or Aunt Wanda would lean over and whisper, "You're the only real daughter." The only real daughter. I listened to Cindy say Dad. I'd listen to Cindy say Dad, and I'd think it sounded so much more natural coming out of her mouth. I'd say it expecting someone to turn and say, "He's not your dad. Your dad is dead." My father sold cars to Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was able to arrange a trip to the LBG ranch for us. There would not be anyone home, but we could walk on the lawn. Anyone could go to the visitor center in Stonewall, at which you could buy a jar of glass cuttings from the lawn. We would be there with the real grass. On the road to LBJ Ranch, we stopped by his birthplace, his family cemetery. Both were open to the public. Soon we were at the Texas White House. We were an odd tour group. Aunt June led the pack. My grandmother and my Aunt Wanda stood close together, clutching handbags. I modeled my hard-won Teen Magazine identity, and Cindy sported her wig. Cowboy hat, reflective glasses, wearing rifle-toting guards welcomed us at the gate. Well, it wasn't really a welcome. Phone calls were made. And then we were told how far away we needed to stay from the house, which was pretty far. All during the trip, my aunt and grandmother kept asking me if I liked Ken, and wouldn't it be nice if my mother and he got married. Mom had been insistent that she and Ken were just friends. I felt I knew her true feelings. I was firm in my position with them that my mother would never marry Ken. But when I got home, while I was sitting in the back of Ken's car, coming home from the airport, Mom said, "So you know Ken and I are going to get married, right?" "Yeah."